The Secret of Primitive Accumulation of Das Kapital. Now, it has to be understood that when Marx uses the term primitive accumulation, he means a kind of accumulation that precedes, comes before capitalist accumulation. In other words, he says an accumulation, not the result of the capitalist mode of production, but its starting point. How is it that capitalism begins? That process he refers to as primitive accumulation. Bourgeois economists, those who support capitalism, have taught us that a long time ago there were two types of people. One was diligent, intelligent, and above all frugal, elite. The other was a lazy rascal spending his substance and more in riotous living. He was wasteful, he was lazy, etc. And it is from this factor that property arose amongst those people who were considered to be intelligent, diligent, and so on, and frugal. But he says this is total nonsense. This is in fact insipid childishness, which every day is preached to us in defense of property. The reality is that property was created through conquest, through enslavement, through robbery, through murder. Briefly, it was created through force. That is what plays the greater part. Yes, of course, there may have been people who were very frugal and they were able to save their property, but that is not how the majority of property was created in the world. Here we are talking about private property of the sort that creates capitalist accumulation. So in other words, capitalist accumulation begins with conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, basically force. If you want an example of this, the best example, of course, are the East India companies and what they did in the East, whether we talk about the British East India Company, the French East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, etc. All of them practiced rapacious kind of trade practices. They are the ones that developed private property. The best example of this in the context of India is the 1793 Permanent Settlement Act, which in one stroke created private property in land. And that is exactly what Marx also emphasizes. He says the capitalist system presupposes the complete separation of the laborer from all property in the means by which they can realize their labor. So the laborer has to be deprived of the means of production. What are the means of production? The means of production are the things through which and in which the laborer can, quote, realize their labor. What does this expression mean? To realize your labor means to be able to labor and to be able to make something from your labor, mixing it with the products of nature, using tools and implements, is to realize labor. When you do labor and you complete it, you have realized your labor. So he says you have to deprive the producer, the ordinary people, you have to create a whole class of people that cannot realize its labor because it does not have the means of production to be able to create the shoes that they know how to create, to be able to create the cloths that they know how to create, to be able to create the clothes that they know how to create. But they can't create them because they don't have the raw materials, they don't have the tools. So you have to deprive people of the ability to realize their labor in order to create the capitalist system. You have to create, in other words, a class of people that has no means of production, a class of people that has no property. As soon as capitalist production is once on its own legs, it not only maintains this separation, but reproduces it on an continually extending scale. Once capitalist production has been created through this process of force and through the process of creation of property, then capitalism itself can deprive people of property and continue on an extended scale. How can it deprive people of property? Through competition. It will bring in its products at cheaper prices, etc., and buy up those who are inefficient producers, and in that way, concentration of property will continue. So realize doesn't mean, oh, I realize now what's happening. To realize means to make it real. That's where the term comes from. Okay? So to realize labor means that you have converted your capacity to labor into something that actually exists. You've made it into something real. You can't do that unless you have tools, unless you have a place to work, unless you have raw materials, etc. Everything you do requires some element of the means of production. Even if you're a computer programmer, you're still going to need a computer to work on. Even if you're a musician, you need some sort of instruments to work on. Even if you're a painter, you need canvas, you need colors, etc. You're a sportsman, you need a place to play. You need a ground to play, you need those pads, you need that equipment. You cannot realize anything. You cannot create a product without the things that are necessary for its creation. If you are a poet or if you are a writer, you still need to be able to access books. You have to have pen, paper, all of those things. You cannot become a great poet if you can't read poetry, and you can't read poetry unless you have books, and you cannot get those books unless you either pay for them or you have access to a library. In all these ways, even the most intellectual kind of labor requires some means of production in order for it to be realizable. I can teach Marxism, but if I just stand on the street corner and start teaching Marxism, I can't do it. I need a hall, I need an institution, I need a computer where I can display my slides. I need this infrastructure to be able to teach it. That's why I am ready to sell my labor power to the Lahore University of Management Sciences so that my labor power becomes a product. You then purchase that product, and that is how the capitalist system functions. The process, therefore, Marx writes, that clears the way for the capitalist system can be none other than the process which takes away from the laborer the possession of his means of production. A process that transforms, on the one hand, the social means of subsistence and of production into capital, on the other, the immediate producer into a wage laborer. Yani, this process of primitive accumulation is the same. It transforms the means of production into capital. Why? Because now with those values you are able to buy what? The wage labor. You are able to buy labor power. And it transforms, on the other hand, the producer into a proletariat, into a wage laborer. How? By depriving him of the means of production. So primitive accumulation creates in one go capital on the one side and labor power on the other side. It creates, in other words, the relationship that is the foundation of capitalism. Capital and labor power are one and the same thing. Capital is the means of production with which you buy labor power, or it is the value with which you buy labor power and also the means of production in order to valorize those values, increase those values. The so-called primitive accumulation, therefore, is nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. The producer has to be separated from the means of production. It appears as primitive because it forms the prehistoric stage of capital and of the mode of production corresponding with it. In other words, it's the prehistory of capitalism. Before capitalism begins, this process has to take place in order for capitalism to come about. And finally, he writes, the expropriation of the agricultural producer, of the peasant from the soil is the basis of the whole process. The peasant has to be separated from the soil. Once the peasant is separated from the soil, the peasant now becomes what? He becomes a wage laborer. He is converted into, his labor is converted into labor power, which is a commodity that can be bought and sold. This is the essence of the process. This process proceeds in different ways in different countries. It's not the same everywhere. In some places it will be accomplished through the state. In other places it might be accomplished through market mechanisms. In other places it might be accomplished through East India Company. In yet other places it might be accomplished in one way or another way. But at its essence, this is what it is. This is the process that creates capitalism.